people around you doesn't make you feel less lonely. Loneliness can happen when positive things happen. Some of us just manage our loneliness much better than others. You could never replace the person that you lose. Hang on a second. No, I'm not okay. And stop denying me for feeling lonely. I know you're trying to help, but it's really unhelpful when you say, I've got family around me and therefore I can't be allowed to feel lonely. Even though we all feel lonely at some point in our lives, if we neglect it, if we do not address it, if we keep sweeping it under the carpet and keep going on, it can become worse.
Don't Be Caught Dead, the show bringing stories of death back to life. Here's your host, Catherine Ashton.
Associate Professor Michelle Lim is the inaugural CEO and Scientific Chair of Ending Loneliness Together. She is a practicing clinical psychologist and is considered the leading Australian scientific expert in loneliness. Thanks for being with us, Michelle.
Thanks for having me, Catherine.
Now, can you explain a little bit about the concept of loneliness as it's defined by your organisation and how it differs from social isolation?
It's a fantastic place to start, Catherine. I think for your listeners, sometimes loneliness and social isolation are often used interchangeably, but actually they are different concepts. So loneliness is about having this subjective feeling of distress that comes up when you feel your social relationships do not meet your current social needs. So this is much more around quality of your relationships and having those meaningful social connection, as opposed to social isolation, which is really about the quantity of contact that you might have with someone or the quantity of friends or connections that you have. Something's a little bit more obvious, so it's much more something that you can count. And we know now that loneliness and social isolation can coexist, but they can also occur independent of each other.
So loneliness can be perhaps hidden issue in someone's life.
That is correct. I think that the issue that we're having right now is that people think that one cannot be lonely because they are around other people. And what we're really trying to do is that we need to kind of rectify and correct that misconception that, people around you doesn't make you feel less lonely. And sometimes some people might argue that it may make you feel more lonely because if you don't get along with those people, you don't have those meaningful social connections. So you can still feel lonely amongst a huge crowd, in the family, working in a big organization, having lots of interactions with people, but still feel that you don't have anyone to understand you, or perhaps you're not really finding your tribe. You don't feel like you belonged.
I think, to be perfectly honest, probably everyone has felt like that at some stage in their life.
Absolutely. I often say if you have a heartbeat, you would feel lonely at some point. And some of us just manage our loneliness much better than others. And I would dare say that, we should all feel lonely at some point, because it's really what we call an innate system, and our checks are just a natural check to reach out to others, to make sure that we connect with others around us in a more meaningful way. So loneliness itself serves a function for us to kind of revise our relationships.
And is that a primitive sort of need that we have?
Absolutely. And to be with others and to have those connections has always been really almost a recipe for the fact that we've thrived and flourished as a species, and for some reason or another in the last century, we have this strange societal or cultural misconception that, loneliness itself is a bad thing. But we know now that it's actually just a part and parcel of our checks and balances within our system, not that's dissimilar to feeling hungry or thirsty or feeling fatigued, that we need rest. Feeling lonely is just a signal for us to do something different about our relationships.
And what do we know about loneliness and how it impacts individuals who have actually, dealing with a loved one who's recently died or has passed at some point?
Yeah, we do unfortunately know quite a bit around intimate relationships that may have experienced the loss of an intimate partner. And this is especially so in older adults. There's a lot of research in that area. And there's actually something what we call intimate loneliness as well. And this is really around, very, very close relationships where you lose someone or you it might not lose someone to death, but sometimes it could be a divorce or separation or change. When you lose that person, it's incredibly difficult for one to rebuild that sense of connection again. And that's not to say it's not impossible, but it's a feeling that a lot of people often complain about being highly distressed about.
And how do we actually deal with this as a community? Like, what can we do?
That's a really good question, Catherine. And there's no really one size fits all solution, because there are people who really need time to grieve. As you would know, we all kind of go through a process of grief in different ways and in different timelines. Psychologists have this miraculous 2-year mark where we say, after 2 years of bereavement, you should be fine. But really, there are people who never really get, over, you want to put it in that horrible term, get over, which is a silly term to use, this loss of the intimate relationship. That's so meaningful to a lot of people. And a classic example of people who have been widowed after 50 years, you could never replace the person that you lose. And it's about managing day to day of how you can actually cope with life after that person has passed, and those kind of sometimes decisions and choices that you have to make, and hard ones to make, to go on. And people do struggle to find those meanings of having to go on post their intimate partner passing away. It's a conversation that a lot of people do struggle with, and not an easy one to resolve right away. It's something that really does take a lot of time.
And what would you say to family members that perhaps may see someone like a parent or a sibling that they recognise that they seem to be struggling?
Yeah. Well, Catherine, this is a really good question to ask. I would really say for them to actually not to acknowledge the loneliness that their parent feels, because often people would say to the parent who's lost the intimate partner, you'll be fine. You have us. You have us, the kids. You have the family. You have the grandkids. You'll be okay. But actually, what we hear from people with lived experience of this is that, hang on a second, no, I'm not okay, and stop denying me for feeling lonely. I know you're trying to help, but it's really unhelpful when you say, I've got family around me, and therefore I can't be allowed to feel lonely. We got to remember that the loss of an intimate person that we hold very dear is very different to the relationship of that of a child and a parent. You could never replace that person. And so it's really around, finding ways of giving them company. You'll never entirely replace that, but giving them meaningful company and companionship so that they feel belong still in that wider group. And they should be allowed to feel lonely, but also to use that to empower them, as opposed to saying you shouldn't feel this way or you shouldn't feel that way because you've got people around you. That's incredibly helpful to the parent who might have lost a husband or wife. Yeah.
So it sounds like we shouldn't invalidate what they're feeling.
Absolutely. And if you just take a moment to reflect how you relate to your intimate partner, to a very close friend, to a child, to a parent, you can see very clearly those relationships are very different in quality, and the way we relate to them is very different. The kinds of things we would tell each of those people would be very different, or confide in would be very different. So when we lose that intimate loved one, it's incredibly hard to replace that. And it's, sure, people can repartner, but often people are not looking to repartner. Often people are looking just to cope. But, there have been success stories in that sense, that people have been young enough when they've lost a spouse that have repartnered and have, they might feel a gap so called, but it's still not quite the same. Again, that unique relationship that you have with that person, that is lost when someone passes, and we should never dismiss that feeling.
And what strategies or interventions have proven effective in alleviating loneliness when people are looking at either end of life or, life-limiting illness?
Yeah. So if I kind of go back to the research, there's really not as much done in this area, which I think it's a bit of a shame, but it's a huge gap in what we know. What we do know with people who are facing the their end of life is that there are times where they would prefer to recontact people to rebuild that relationship, that meaningful relationship, but there are others who just do not want that. And that's really, again, to be respectful of their decision of not having to rebuild a relationship in probably what we would call the most difficult time of their lives. So it's really up to the individual of whether they would like to repair or rebuild or recontact, or just simply touch base with existing people to talk about how they feel. And just having as well kind of been through palliative care with my family, for example, I do know it's an incredibly difficult period with relationships. Often people who are also facing the end of life, there are people who kind of almost go into complete withdrawal mode, which is, I just need to concentrate on moving to the next phase, and I really don't need that noise. So there are people who are like that. And I think that's, again, something that we need to respect, and something that is absolutely that should be their say, and they should have control over that.
So tell me, Michelle, what does the research tell us about loneliness, and what are the impacts of that, on the long-term health of individuals?
Well, what we do know now is that loneliness is something that should not be trivialized. It is an issue that even though we all feel lonely at some point in our lives, if we neglect it, if we do not address it, if we keep sweeping it under the carpet and keep going on, it can become worse. And when it becomes worse, that's when it becomes physiologically and mentally stressful. So what we really need to do now is to reposition the issue and to say that loneliness is something that we can tackle really early. If we don't tackle it, we do know that we are more likely to experience other kind of health problems, not just mental health problems. Most people think that loneliness is a mental health issue. It's not. Loneliness also has a kind of much more physical impact on people. We do know that loneliness, for example, kind of leads to poorer heart health 4 years down the line. Now, we don't know exactly how it leads to poorer heart health. We know that the theory is supposed to be that if you're lonely, you're less likely to exercise better or eat better. You're just less incentivized to be held, to do these kind of healthy kind of behaviors, because you don't really have anyone to answer to. So having meaningful social connection, someone even to nag at you, Catherine, to go see the doctor. You complain that your heart is not, feeling really strange. You really need to go see your doctor now. Even just having that meaningful other to nag at us can sometimes keep us healthier. That's the kind of the running joke I have with my partners. I'm keeping him alive because you're nagging.
With your nagging, I love it.
Yeah, you got to go see the doctor. I'm keeping. Maybe he's taking years off my life, but I'm adding to his.
But it's something interesting that you're talking about is that habitual everyday routine of having someone else in the home with you.
Yeah.
So, even in a share home,
Yes,
it's still someone else coming in and out.
It is, but it's also not just simply having that one person. We do know from the kind of more traditional research is that social isolation, which is, as I mentioned earlier, the quantity of people around you, that does make a difference to our health as well, and our what we call mortality, which is how early we die. So that has important implications as well. And we do know that people who live with others are more likely to survive, for example, or more likely to recover. But it's not just the quantity, it's also how you feel about the person, because I have heard as well of housemates who just don't know each other very well. And a very classic example, I have a colleague that she fell and hit her head in the bathroom, and she wasn't found 48 hours later because unfortunately she lived in a household of 8 other housemates who did not check on her, and she ended up in hospital for the month. So she lived, again, she's a classic case of you live with people, but if they don't go in and check on you and they don't care about you, it makes little difference to the how we live and our quality of life. So we need to be able to know not just that someone's with us or around us, but also if we have that meaningful connection to them, that they know that we can trust to say to them, I don't feel well, and we can trust, that they would say, go see the doctor. That relationship still needs to exist.
So it's like a reframing we need to be aware of. So it's not just thinking that it's those people around, so therefore they won't be lonely, but it's actually dependent on, I suppose it's a level of vulnerability that you're able to share with another person, isn't it?
Yes, our ability to bond with people, and that does need vulnerability. And I think maybe, Catherine, you kind of hit a nail on the head here. I think, maybe we don't feel like we have the permission to be vulnerable to other people and to build those strong relationship bonds. And as a clinical psychologist of over 20 years now, I can tell you the number of people who are afraid to really be their true self, to be vulnerable with other people. That's something that people do struggle with, because what they're really trying to do is to prevent hurt. They're trying to not, sometimes not reinitiate the trauma that they might have experienced as a child. They close up. But the problem with closing up is that it's very difficult to open up and to build those relationship bonds. We need to have an ability to know when to open the gates and when to close the gates, or how to kind of do that in a healthy way. And people do struggle with that. When they feel lonely, often people just shut out. They shut down and they just don't open up, and they don't know how to navigate that.
So how do we navigate it better?
Look, I really think that a lot of this is awareness and education, but also making sure that you take those steps that you feel like you can do it. I often kind of say to people that they often put these really high standards on themselves, and they say things like, for me to be less lonely, I need to have a new best friend, or I need to have 5 new best friends. But they don't realize how difficult it is to have best friends as you get older. And for me,
Yeah.
my goal is more, if you spoke to one more person that day and said hi, even if it's a superficial level, that's enough. And so getting them to kind of start from more basics, start from things that can be done, not things that they assume they have to do it, like to get to know more people, or to be surrounded all the time by people. Those things are not as important as having that kind of, high quality, meaningful relationships, and to start from thinking about what they can do first and then just build that.
And in a society where we are always looking at that projection, and I'm thinking about technology and how we document our lives on Instagram and those sorts of things, how is that sort of exacerbating the problem of loneliness? Is it?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I think it's quite easy to talk about social media and technology in a negative way. And we all know here, right from the start, that this modality and using tech is it's not going to go away. We know now that this is here to stay, and this has been, a good 20 years since we've had social media and interacting with each other that way. And in many ways, it's really good because we can connect with people from the other side of the world. But what it has done, I think, is it's kind of changed the way we interact with people, and it changed the way we start or maintain relationships. Now, it's not really necessarily about the tool itself, it's really around how we use it and how we use it to our advantage. Because we have done things like, focus groups with older people who talk about technology in a very more positive way. What they're really doing is they're connecting with friends and family that don't live near them. They actually do feel less lonely. And think about the pandemic, how much we were able to remain connected to loved ones who we might be physically separated from. So this is where
Yeah.
technologies can be used for good. And then we need to think about not using it entirely to replace our face-to-face interactions, because we do get a different quality of interactions when we actually talk to someone face-to-face, or when we see them in person. And the nature of those interactions are highly valued. And I think we've started to become a little bit too relaxed over that. We always almost favor, say, online meetings over face-to-face meetings. And whilst I know it does save time, I still see the value of often seeing a person in 3D, as I call it, and you get a
Yeah.
different quality from it. You are able to read them better. especially having more eye contact, because we're not really having appropriate eye contact when we use these online forms of interacting. We're not really looking at each other in the eye. And we know
Yeah.
body language is very important, and we don't necessarily catch that online. So meeting people face to face is equally important, and we should still place a lot of value over that.
And in relation to healthcare professionals, what do they need to be mindful of when it comes to working in aged care, dealing with patients with terminal illness or life-limiting illness, or the bereaved?
Yeah.
What's the sort of things that they need to be mindful of?
And speaking on the healthcare professional, on the behalf of healthcare professionals, we're not really trained necessarily to always understand what loneliness looks like, how it presents, how we can spot it. We're not trained in our training. There's no course that we undergo to actually learn how to identify loneliness. We need to actually start implementing those in our kind of training programs. But I think that we need to be able to have these respectful conversations. People who feel lonely already think they are a burden. They think they're ashamed. They're embarrassed. They actually conceal it. We know that at least 1 in 2 Australians who say that they feel lonely, they actively conceal it. So sometimes it's around navigating how to have that conversations in a way that isn't threatening, that lets them open up and feel empowered, and not treat the person who feels lonely as if they don't have any skills and qualities. Because I think often when people have these conversations, while they're trying to help in a meaningful way, or they're trying to help in the most well-intentioned way, they sometimes can come across as kind of disrespectful to the person who does feel lonely. So I think we need to be very careful about learning how to talk about it, being respectful, not assume that just because what works for you is going to work for them, because loneliness is subjective. And I often really just start with the most basic question of, what can I do to help? If we can start with that basic question, open it up, get to understand what takes for that person. What's going to work for them isn't necessarily going to work for you. So don't assume, hey, if you join a group, that you'll be fine. Why don't you just go outside and, they're running a group and, this music club, you should just do that. Maybe it might work for you, but if that person's reluctant, perhaps there's a lot more going for them than we imagine. So what else what kind of support do they need? So really just hold back and ask those open-ended questions, and never dismiss those feelings of loneliness if it does come up.
And from what you're saying, loneliness is something that could present itself at any stage and any age of life.
At absolutely any age of life. And I think people often assume that some ages are more protected than others, but it's not the case. We do find that loneliness, again, comes up when we are navigating, especially when we navigate those social challenges in our lives. And if you kind of think about even just our life to date, you can think about all the bumps, and the way we even think about our relationships has changed, and our needs have changed, even just within us. So, it's quite normal to feel lonely at any given point. It's more around managing it and the kinds of resources that we might have access to manage our loneliness.
And so, what are some of the misconceptions around loneliness?
So the biggest misconceptions is that we have to know more people to actually feel less lonely. And we know that that's not the case, as we know the difference between social isolation and loneliness. But also that loneliness only affects older people. They do tend to constrain. They have this picture of older person sitting in a nursing home and looking out at the window. That's kind of what comes up for them when they use the word lonely. But loneliness doesn't have a face. That I can see very clearly why people might think that, because of that conflation with what social isolation is. This is not to say that older Australians are not lonely. They are. They are also socially isolated, but loneliness can look very different. And I have met, very, very high performing CEOs, in my practice, for example, who, manage big teams and, are very prominent in their field. But at the end of the day on Friday night, and they close their door, they don't speak to anyone, and they don't have any other interactions with anyone else until the next Monday, and feel incredibly lonely on the weekends because they're really struggling to, find the time to reconnect or find the time to make new friends because of their workload. Everyone goes through loneliness. It's a matter of how we manage it, what kind of resources we have, whether we're willing to also reinvest in those relationships or reinvest in ourselves to kind of gain more relationships, because it can be incredibly hard. And not everyone wants to necessarily cope with their loneliness with more people. Sometimes people just want to cope with their loneliness with something else.
And so it seems to be key in talking about loneliness or supporting someone who may be lonely. Sounds like it's very similar to support someone who may be grieving. And that is, from what I'm understanding, is don't assume, but ask what that person would like or what they need.
Yeah, I think that's spot on, because again, it's such a subjective experience. And and also I think even on that note, maybe a little bit different to grief, loneliness can happen when positive things happen. When you actually become a new parent, when you actually go to a new country to get an awesome job, when there's a new family member that maybe is brought in and married in, and you feel like you're on the outer all of a sudden. All these positive things can also bring about social challenges. So that's not assumed as well. It's like, oh, you should be happy, or you've moved to a new school, or you've moved to a new job. You must be feeling great about that. Sometimes some people are really struggling to make new relationships for whatever reason, and because of time constraints, money constraints, that mobility issues. We don't know what it is. And so it's such a common experience, loneliness, but all of us, and what leads to our loneliness is very different.
And so today is Dying to Know Day, the 8th of August, and it's right in amongst Ending Loneliness Week.
Yes.
So what do you suggest people do if they are concerned about a loved one?
Look, I think we need to think about making sure that we know that everyone has a role to play. It's just a matter of what you can do. All of us can do something. And, sometimes it's kind of hard to have that conversation with that person, but always making yourself available, or even just kind of normalizing it and talking about sometimes your experience of loneliness can sometimes put someone else at ease in a way that's, brief and not make it about yourself, kind of there's a bit of a balance there to kind of have an opener. And if the person's willing to kind of talk about loneliness, really, what I often say, don't trivialize the experience. Never trivialize. You can normalize it without trivializing it, but also that really having only open-ended questions. What has made you feel connected in the past? Who do you think you can confide in? Because it might not be about you. And someone's loneliness is not a consequences of something you did or did not do. I think this is really important that you need to remember, because people often kind of take offense to, why is my mother feeling lonely? Am I not giving her enough? This is not about you. This is about what your mother needs other than you. So actually having that reminder of, don't take it personally. This is not about this, someone's loneliness that who you care about very much. Just asking about what you can do, how you can help, who they can go to, what they can try, and what is it that they think they can do now. We don't. Again, this is not about making new best friends. It's about just having little quality interactions or little interactions along the way. And, before we know it, we gain that social confidence where we start being able to, turn acquaintances into friends, and, friends into closer friends. We can start somewhere, but we need to really empower the person and not kind of tell them what they have to do, get them to really reflect on what they can do.
Michelle, I think that's such powerful advice, because sometimes we do make it about ourselves and think, oh, what have I done?
Yes.
What can I do?
Yes.
But from what you're saying, it really is about empowering the person who is feeling lonely on how they can feel more connected themselves.
Absolutely. Again, this is their experience, and it may not have anything to do with you at all. So it's about giving them that safe space, because if we don't do that safe space, they're more likely to never trust you again and just close up.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for your time today, Michelle.
Thank you, Catherine, for having me.
Don't be caught dead forgetting to subscribe. And here are some more videos we know you'll love.